Welcome everyone to Cornell Keynotes. On today's show, we're going to examine how team diversity may or may not influence or bring about creativity in the workplace on teams. This conversation is partially inspired by research conducted by our guest, Devon Proudfoot, who is a Cornell ILR professor who co-authored a recent piece published in Management Science called The Diversity Heuristic: How Team Demographic Composition Influences Judgments of Team Creativity. We're going to share the URL for that piece, so be sure to check that out. Also joining us as host is Sean Fath, who is professor of organizational behavior at the ILR School. Also, both Devon and Sean are faculty authors of several online eCornell courses related to today's topic, including building diverse talent pools, adopting inclusive hiring practices, promoting inclusive onboarding, and employee success. We're going to share the URLs to those courses as well. If you are looking for education in this space and aiming to level up in your career, learning from these two would be a very smart move. Devon and Sean, great to have you two in the studio today.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, you bet. Listeners, before I pass the mic over to Sean, our host today, I want to remind you that we'll take your questions in the chat throughout the conversation. I'll get them here. Also, heads up for links to those online courses that we just mentioned. And if you haven't checked out the Cornell Keynotes podcast, definitely do that. We're going to share the URL for that. Lots of stuff to do, lots of homework. This is going to be a dense conversation today. So we're going to throw the URL up for that podcast. As always, we are live right now, but the recording will be available shortly after we're through. And now, Sean and Devon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's just dive right in. The first thing I thought would be good to chat about is, when we think about diversity as sort of a broad idea, what do we mean when we say diversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So today we're really talking about diversity in groups of people or teams of people, right? And so how that influences creativity. So when we're thinking about how to define diversity in a group, what we're really thinking about is to what extent there are differences present between the people in that group. So how much variety do we see when we look at the group in terms of demographic differences? So for instance, race or gender, age. And also we can think about diversity in terms of more sort of deep level characteristics of a group. So personality differences, knowledge differences, education differences, differences in perspectives. So we can think about diversity in different ways, right? Sort of these surface level characteristics. To what extent do we see variability in demographics present in a group of people? We can also think about it in terms of whether we can sort of collect some data and see how much variability is underlying the surface in terms of sort of cognitive differences between members. So one thing that's important to think about when we're thinking about a diverse group is that diversity is the property of the group itself, right? Yeah. We can't really look at one individual and know, is this individual diverse or not? Doesn't really make sense, right? Because it's really about the differences between people, to what extent there are meaningful differences that makes a group diverse or not. So when we're looking at this body of research on the impact of group diversity on creativity, we will also need to think about, what are we comparing the diverse group to, right? And so often in these kinds of studies, what we're comparing a diverse group to is what's known as a homogeneous group. So a group basically where everyone sort of seems very similar, right? They don't have a lot of variability either in demographic characteristics or in underlying cognitive differences like education or perspective or attitudes, right? So we're comparing homogeneity and how homogeneity in a group leads to creativity to diversity in a group and how that leads to creativity. So it's important to keep that contrast in mind.
That makes sense. And I mean, it's easy to think about groups or teams that would be similar in terms of these deep level characteristics that we talked about, similar training or background, right? Or they're all from the same department. And easily we can also think about groups or teams that might be similar in surface level characteristics too. And something that comes to mind is that we might often assume that these deep level differences, training, perspectives, ways of thinking, co-occur with these surface level differences. And do you think that's the case? Is it maybe sort of a noisy signal, the surface level difference to the deep level difference?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So we'll talk about this as we sort of unpack some of the research in this area. But I think that for now, what I'll say is oftentimes there is sort of a correlation between demographic differences and underlying differences in life experience, for instance, right? So if we take gender diversity, for instance, in many ways, men and women have different life experiences because they take on different social roles in society and so forth. So we can sort of expect in some cases for demographic differences to translate to differences in deep level characteristics. However, we shouldn't necessarily assume that every sort of surface level demographic difference necessarily means that there's underlying cognitive differences, right? So you can imagine people that look different, but they actually all pretty much think the same way, right? Because they perhaps have different or the sort of similar education. They all are best friends. They hang out all the time. They're all thinking in very much the same way. So that correlation can be there, but it's not always there, and we shouldn't assume it.
That makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I don't want us to jump ahead. So let's pivot a little bit. So we've been talking so far about diversity in groups as an attribute of groups and different levels of diversity. But what about when we think about creativity? What do you mean when you study creativity, when you think about creativity? How are you thinking about it?
Sure, right. So there's a huge amount of research that's been done on how to make both individuals and groups more creative. And typically when researchers are talking about this idea of creativity, the most common definition is a creative idea or product is an idea or product that is both novel and useful. So it sort of has two dimensions if we think about how to define creativity. So if we think of novelty, really what we're thinking of, okay, is this idea, to what extent is this idea different than a given standard or common ways in which we do things, right? So to what extent does it diverge from sort of the status quo or the standard? So that's one facet of creativity. So novelty, how novel, how original is an idea. But there's also this usefulness component. So not only does an idea have to be original and novel, it also has to provide value or be appropriate within a given context for it really to be creative in the way that we think about it, sort of, for instance, in a business context.
Yeah.
A good way of thinking about this is you can throw out lots of weird ideas, like crazy weird ideas, and those would be highly novel ideas. But if that idea doesn't solve like a business's problem or is not feasible for that business to pursue, then we wouldn't really call it creative because it's failing that sort of usefulness test. So therefore, when we're thinking about how to measure creativity, we say, okay, an idea is creative if it's both novel, so it diverges from the status quo, it's different than what we've done before, but it also is useful. It helps us solve a problem that we're trying to solve.
That makes sense, having usefulness as a piece of that. That's intuitive when you think about, say I was trying to come up with creative ideas for new sandwiches at a deli. Something super novel would be a concrete sandwich, but nobody's going to eat that, right? So it makes sense that needs to be a piece of it too.
Right. Consumers would want to eat it, would be the usefulness piece, right? It could make money, for instance. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So sticking on this topic of creativity for a moment, in scientific research broadly, in your studies of creativity, how are we measuring it?
Great question. So there are different ways to measure creativity. So we can think about asking people how creative a person is, and I'll get to that a little bit later in our discussion. We can also think about asking people how creative an idea is, right? So when we're thinking about measuring or sort of tapping into the creativity of an idea, often what researchers do is they simply ask people, how creative is this idea, right? They have people rate the creativity of an idea. They often ask people to rate the novelty and the usefulness of the idea, and they sort of combine those ratings to get a rating of creativity. Oftentimes, if we're trying to gather creativity ratings, we might also ask people with a bit of expertise, right? So we might not just ask a random person on the street, oh, hey, how creative do you think this business idea is? We might ask someone who actually knows sort of the field, has a bit of knowledge and education to assess how novel and useful a new idea is. So that's one common way to measure creativity. We also often see in the literature more objective ratings of the creativity of ideas. So typically, if we are looking at a big group of ideas, so let's say people were brainstorming, they have 100 ideas, we can sort of generate an objective rating of the creativity of a particular idea within that group by simply looking at how infrequent that idea was mentioned within the larger group of ideas,
see,
right? So if you're brainstorming for a bunch of new ideas for a product and, 50 of those ideas were very similar to each other, then those ideas are all sort of not creative. However, if you see an idea in that group of ideas and no one else has mentioned that idea, you can sort of objectively say, well, in this data set that we have of ideas, that idea is quite creative, right? It's quite novel. It's quite different than all the other ideas. So there are ways to sort of move away from the subjective rating way of measuring creativity and also think about more objective measures of creativity as well.
So sticking on that subject, so that makes sense as sort of a quantitative measure of creativity, but to me that sounds like a quantitative measure of novelty, right? So we're sort of objectively getting at the novelty piece. When we think about objective ratings of usefulness or utility, are we thinking then about, the expert, like the sandwich expert is the one judging the utility of the concrete sandwich in an objective sense?
Right. Yeah. So when we get to thinking about objective measures, I think that there are more clear ways to measure novelty than usefulness, right? Just sort of thinking about what I described. Sure. And I think that oftentimes when we're thinking about what really distinguishes a creative idea from an idea that's just high quality, it is this novelty component, right? And so I think often when we're thinking about creativity, even though we want something that's both novel and useful, often it's really the novelty piece we're trying to figure out and measure, right? To say like, is this really cool? Is this really new? And then later we can think about, okay, does it have value? Is it feasible? Will consumers like it, et cetera? But that's a great point that when we're thinking about objective measures, often they prioritize novelty over usefulness.
That makes sense. It might be easier for people to assess too, just off the cuff, right? So sort of bringing all of this back together, before we get into, how we think diversity might impact creativity, can we just talk about the actual link, or perhaps lack thereof, between diversity in a group and maybe the creativity of the ideas that group comes up with?
Totally, yeah. So there's been a lot of research on this. And I know that also organizations, businesses really care about this connection between diversity and creativity. So there's been a lot of discussion on this. And I think that it's a really interesting topic because often what we hear is that, yes, diversity in groups is good for creativity, right? Diverse groups of people create more innovative solutions than homogenous groups of people. However, when you look at the research, what's really surprising is that it's actually much more complex than that, right? If we look at decades and decades of research, sort of summarizing all these different studies looking at the impact of diversity on teams, so comparing diverse teams to homogenous teams, and which teams are most creative or produce the most creative ideas and products, what we see if we summarize across all these studies is not a lot of strong evidence that more diversity necessarily leads to more creativity in teams. So we sort of see that the results are all over the place. So sometimes diverse teams outperform homogenous teams, sometimes homogenous teams outperform diverse teams, and sometimes there's no difference, right? Homogenous teams and diverse teams sort of perform similarly on creative tasks. So this is surprising, right? Because it's not what we often hear about. What we often hear about are those specific studies that are showing these positive effects of diversity on creativity, or evidence that more diverse teams lead to more innovative outcomes. So the reality is, and the way I like to think about it, is that diversity in teams can increase creativity under the right circumstances, but we shouldn't necessarily expect every diverse team to outperform every homogenous team just by virtue of the fact that that team is diverse. Certain conditions need to be in place for that to happen.
Okay. Yeah, this strikes me as a fact of life. Often the true answer to the question is more complicated than a simple yes or no.
Indeed.
So thinking about, does diversity influence creativity positively or negatively? Perhaps it can under the right circumstances. I want us to get into those circumstances, but just holding on this subject for a second, has the research on diversity and its objective links to creativity, has it focused mostly on these surface level characteristics in teams, or these deep level characteristics, or maybe both? Could we be more sure about one or the other variance in that attribute and its link to creativity, positive or negative?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when we're thinking about what kinds of diversity the research has looked at, certainly we do see a lot of attention paid to these demographic differences. So things like race and gender and the impact of those kinds of diversity on team creativity. So we have a lot of information about that. And we also have quite a bit of information on certain kinds of deep level characteristics and the impacts of those differences on creativity. So things like differences in education or functional background, right? So if you have people from like marketing, R&D, finance on a team, that's a functionally diverse team versus a functionally homogenous team is a team where everyone's from marketing or everyone's from accounting, right? So we do have some data to allow us to understand, okay, what is the impact of demographic diversity, race, gender, age, those kinds of things on creativity, and also what is the impact on more sort of deep level cognitive differences, functional differences, educational differences, et cetera, and how does that impact creativity? And if we look at meta-analyses, what we do find if we sort of weigh the evidence is that when it comes to demographic differences, that's really where we see a lot of conflicting effects, right? So sometimes diversity is positive, sometimes negative, sometimes there's a null effect, right? Which tells us that there's something sort of moderating those effects, right? There's certain conditions that are in place sometimes, but not, that are leading there to be different outcomes for those diverse teams. We see a little more positivity in terms of the effects of diversity on creativity when we're looking at these deep level differences like functional background, right? And so I think that leads to the question of why, right? So I think one of the reasons why is if we think about sort of the basic theory of why diversity should increase creativity, really it's about different perspectives, right? The different perspectives help us think of new ideas. They help us think of the world in a different way. And when we combine those different perspectives, we're going to come up with innovative solutions. And a very straightforward way to get different perspectives is through things like functional diversity, differences in educational background, et cetera. So that really works in a pretty straightforward way. However, when we move over to demographic differences, perhaps those demographic differences lead to differences in perspective, right? We just talked about this, differences in life experiences. However, and maybe I'm getting ahead of us a little bit, when we're thinking of demographic differences, we not only get differences in perspective potentially, but we also get potential discomfort, distrust, in groups and out groups, right? All that stuff that we learn about when we think about what it's like and the challenges of dealing with people that are different than us, right? On these dimensions that are also associated with status differences, for instance. And so we sort of have these two different forces that are working against each other that might help us explain why it is that when we look at demographic diversity, we aren't always seeing this positive impact on creativity.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so let's dig into this then. So as we think about, these circumstances under which maybe we'll work as a, hypothetical here, only with demographic differences and diversity in demographics or homogeneity in demographics at a team level. When would we expect that variance to lead to more creativity or maybe less? What are some of the gatekeeping factors there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one thing that's important to think about is I always sort of do this thought experiment with my students is think what it would be like to be in a demographically diverse versus a demographically homogenous team, right? So let's think just really simplistically right now about gender diversity. So I'm a woman. I'm going to imagine myself in a group of all women and what that would be like versus I'm going to imagine myself in a group of some women and quite a few men, right? And I ask my students to think about this for themselves, thinking of themselves in a group with similar others, i.e. a homogenous group, or thinking of themselves in a group with some similar others and some different others, right? And I ask them, okay, so in what kind of group would you feel more comfortable in? In what kind of group would you feel at ease and willing to speak up and share ideas and just sort of feel relaxed? And everyone, of course, says, oh, the homogenous group, right? If I'm in a group of all women, for me, it feels pretty good, right? If I'm in a group with some men, some women, maybe I'm a little more reluctant to speak up, right? I'm more waiting to see how other people act, what the norms are. And we can think about this in terms of gender. We can think about this in terms of race. So racially similar others versus racially different others. People tend to feel more comfortable with people who are from the same group as themselves. And so when we start thinking in this way, it becomes pretty clear to us these very different sort of psychological experiences we have in a homogenous group that sort of allow us to feel free to speak up and contribute, and maybe a little bit more reluctance that we'd feel in a more diverse group where people are different than us. We're not sure what they think about us. We're not sure if we're going to be friends with them. We don't want to say the wrong thing to them. And so we might be a little more guarded. And this might sort of help us start to understand why it is that diverse groups sometimes have these challenges in collaborating and information sharing that homogenous groups don't have.
That makes sense. So we could have a group setting where, we have a diverse group, but, that group that's diverse in terms of gender or in terms of race or perhaps both could also vary in the extent to which the people in that group feel, very safe speaking up or maybe feel a little bit of tension doing so. Yep. There's more or less interpersonal fluidity. So is that one of the major moderators of this process?
Yeah, I think that sort of brings us to these two sort of competing mechanisms, right? So if we think about comparing a diverse team to a homogeneous team, a diverse team has the potential to be more creative than the homogeneous team because of that like potential for different perspectives to sort of come together and generate a novel solution. However, the diverse team also has a potential to sort of perform worse on creative tasks compared to the homogeneous team because of these tensions or challenges related to in-groups and out-groups and the discomfort and distrust that can come with working with people that are different than you. So when we think about this, what we're trying to do is get more of that speaking up with different perspectives mechanism highlighted and emphasized, and mute that negative pathway where people are feeling uncomfortable or sort of distant from the other people in their group and not really collaborating and communicating effectively.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I think if we think about the maximally homogenous team, if I'm in a team with like 5 other Seans, I would be super comfortable. But we wouldn't be very creative because we don't have any unique information to share with each other, right? So we would be, shooting out ideas, but they're all the same ideas because it's just 6 Seans. And that's good to think.
Great example.
Okay. Do we want to shoot Chris over to some audience questions?
Yeah, we do. There's a cool through line developing in the audience chatter. I'd like to bring one up. A question from Vanessa asks, would you say a main condition that allows diverse teams to outperform homogeneous teams is inclusive leadership, or how the team leader leads and encourages creative outputs? Any thoughts on that one?
Thanks so much, Vanessa. So I love that question because that allows me to lead into exactly what I was hoping to bring up next, which is when we're thinking about the influence of diversity on creativity in teams, what's often missing is this discussion of inclusive leadership or inclusion, right? That you can't expect diversity to lead to creativity without inclusion, right? And inclusion obviously is this big concept. Everyone always asks, what exactly do we mean by inclusion? But one way to make it more concrete is to think of these leadership behaviors that facilitate sort of a climate of inclusion, right? So what can leaders actually do in a team to make people more comfortable, right, around others who are dissimilar to them, right? So certainly, yes, I think that is an excellent point, and certainly what the research suggests is really important to allow those diverse teams to move on that positive path of sharing perspectives and being more creative, and less likely to move on that negative path where people are feeling uncomfortable or unwilling to share.
So maybe before we move on to perhaps another audience question.
Go ahead.
So when we think about these actions that leaders can take to, facilitate feelings of inclusivity, psychological safety at the team level, my willingness to speak up and not worry about being judged or any tensions I might feel about that, what are some of these things leaders can do?
Yeah, great question. So you mentioned this idea of psychological safety, which I think is really important, and sort of, again, makes this idea of inclusion or inclusive leadership more concrete. So what can a leader do to increase psychological safety in a team, which is really important for helping people feel more comfortable speaking up? So basically, the idea of psychological safety is, to what extent do I feel in the team that I won't be sort of humiliated or criticized if I speak up with a divergent opinion or my own perspective, right? Do I feel sort of safe to do that? Or am I like nervous that you're going to be judging me negatively if I have a different viewpoint than you or if I say something stupid, right? So if you're on a team where you feel a high degree of psychological safety, obviously that's amazing, right? Because you're going to speak up. Others are going to speak up, hopefully, because everyone's feeling that way. And we're going to see a lot of collaboration and movement towards generating creative ideas. In terms of what leaders can do, what the research suggests is that a lot of this has to do with modeling, right? So if you're a leader on the team, you want to sort of model the idea that it's okay to make mistakes, that I'm not going to criticize you if you do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, that we're not going to play the blame game on this team, that it's okay to have a different perspective. And so you want to sort of both as a leader literally say those things to your team members, but also model those things. So you might say, tell a story about how you made a mistake once, how you, had a different perspective than everyone, but you still spoke up with that perspective. So sort of modeling and communicating that it's okay to sort of be yourself, bring your own perspective and unique views to the table. I think these are great behaviors to try to get your team feeling a little bit more psychologically safe.
That makes sense. So my understanding is that in addition to thinking about, signals that leaders can send vis-a-vis inclusivity. If part of the issue is, the potential for conflict at the team level, would you say it's right that, other types of exercises that teams or groups could engage in to sort of get around this could be things like, team building or developing a shared identity or a shared system of goals and motivations that makes the team feel like more of a cohesive unit?
Totally, yeah. So anything you can do to make people sort of get to know each other in a non-superficial way, especially across difference, this can be really useful in building sort of team identity and getting people to sort of bring the walls down a little bit and be more willing to share themselves with others. So another area of research that I think is really cool and sort of makes us think about inclusion in a more concrete way is research on identity congruence in teams. So essentially what this research shows is that identity congruence is this really important moderator if we're thinking about the relationship between demographic diversity and creativity. So what do I mean by identity congruence? So basically identity congruence is the extent to which if we're on a team together, you and me, you see me in the same way that I see myself. So if we're on a team together and like I think that I'm like a really, analytical, quantitatively focused person, and you're looking at me and you think that I'm someone who's much more interested in, marketing or PR, there is no identity congruence there, right? You see me totally differently than I see myself, and those teams tend to do really poorly, right? And when we're thinking about diversity in teams, because of things like stereotyping, for instance, we're likely to see sort of at baseline more, lack of identity congruence compared to a homogenous team. A team of all Seans, probably they all get each other, right? They all know what each other's about. There's high identity congruence. But in diverse teams, at baseline, there's often sort of a lack of identity congruence. People are making assumptions about other people's identities, and those aren't necessarily true. Right. However, if we can find a way to reach identity congruence in teams so that, the way I see myself, what's important to me, what am I bringing to the table is the same, is aligned with how you see me and my identity. If we can make that happen in a team under those circumstances, what research shows is that then diverse teams actually outperform homogenous teams. So once we get to identity congruence, then we see the positive impact of diversity on creativity. So if we're thinking about, going back to your original question, how do we get there? It's really about information sharing. So for instance, I could express to you what's important to me, how I see myself. But it's also about, you asking me questions, right? Like you not making assumptions and trying to get to know me as a person, right? And so any sort of team building exercise that allows people to share who they are and to gather information about other people in the team, it's likely to really enhance not only team cohesion and identity, but this idea of identity congruence, which has been shown to be so important for creativity.
This is useful for managers to know too, as they think about how to, structure team building exercises, right? Maybe it's better to avoid going on the ropes course and instead, structuring scenarios in which we can actually get to know individuating information about people that's accurate.
Totally.
So, I mean, we've sort of covered this, I think, to a good amount at this point, but if you had to just do a high level summary of, the challenges that diverse teams face in trying to unlock their creativity, and then maybe some of like the remediating factors, just a top line summary, what would you say?
Sure. So I think that if we're thinking about, let's say I find myself in a diverse team, what am I going to assume? I'm going to think this team has the potential to come up with really creative ideas because we may have a lot of different perspectives. And if we are able to combine them, maybe we can come up with something really cool and innovative. However, I'm also going to take a pause and say, okay, what conditions need to be in place for those different perspectives to be brought to bear, to be combined in a useful way? And I'm sort of going to take a pause and say, what, this is not necessarily going to lead to creativity, just this fact that there's different people around me on this team. We're going to all have to work really hard to sort of reap the rewards of that diversity, right? We're going to really have to work together to really collaborate, communicate together. And if we're able to do that, then yes, maybe we're going to be able to sort of capitalize on those differences to come up with a really innovative solution, for instance.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great top level summary. So we've been thinking so far about teams, right? When are teams that are demographically diverse more or less creative? What are the impediments to that? What are some solutions? But I think we can sort of shift a little bit to think as well about individuals, right? If we have just an individual, does being around different people who are, perhaps demographically distant from me or culturally distant from me or just distant in experience, will that influence my own creativity or my potential for creativity?
Yeah, that's a great intuition. So I love this question. So before we were really talking about if I'm in a team situation where I have to, with my team, come up with a creative solution, how does diversity in that team influence creativity? But in a work context, often we're trying to work alone on coming up with a creative solution, but we're around other people, right? So what you're asking is, in this latter situation, how does the diversity of those other people that I'm around, but not really working with, but just sort of maybe chatting with on the side or, engaging with at work, how does that influence my personal solo creativity? And there's some really interesting research that I really like that basically shows that the more you have contact with people from different cultures, for instance, that really does increase your personal creativity, your ability to think about creative ideas and creative solutions. And this research is really cool. A lot of it's like focused on people who've had multicultural experiences, as you mentioned, right? So they've traveled to different countries. And really what it gets at is that it's not really enough to just sort of do a superficial, quick trip to a different culture and think that's going to make you really creative. It's really when you're really embedded in that new culture that it has that positive impact on your creativity, because your cognition, your way of thinking about the world is really transformed and allows you to think about things in a different way. So it has to be sort of a deeper connection to a different culture. It can't just be like a quick trip around the world. And if we sort of translate this to the workplace, what we're thinking about is you can't just sort of have these superficial relationships with people from different backgrounds in the office. You really need to do a little bit of work to get to know them, to develop relationships with them, to learn from them. And only when you do that should you expect it to impact your personal creativity in a positive way.
So some of the same, themes that we were touching on at the group level are relevant at the individual level too, where it's, thinking about deep level connections with people, learning more about them can yield benefits for the teams and also for the, the individuals nestled in a group environment.
Totally.
Cool. So let's pivot just a little. So we've been talking so far about objective links between, group characteristics and their actual potential for creativity, and also now a little bit about individuals. But much of your research is looking at something a little bit different, which is perceptions of creativity, right? If I need to estimate the likelihood that someone's going to be creative, what information am I using to form that judgment? How are, aspects of the person maybe influencing that, or myself? So could you talk a little bit about what you found in this research when you're looking at perceptions?
Happy to do that. Yeah. So I have several different papers. So I think like in this research, what I'm really interested in is this idea that often in organizations, we are bombarded with lots of ideas and options and paths forward. And often it's a manager's job to figure out, okay, which idea is the creative idea here that I want to pursue? How do I actually make a judgment about any of this stuff that's in front of me and decide, okay, we're going to pursue this product idea because this is the really cool creative idea. We're going to hire this person because this person's the really creative person, right? And so I'm really curious about how people form judgments about who and what is creative, right? How do they actually figure this out? And it turns out that actually people are kind of bad at this. So part of this is because creativity is sort of a squishy concept, right? So we obviously defined it earlier, right? And this is how researchers think of creativity. But if we ask the average person on the street, what is creativity? They might all have different sort of opinions about what exactly it is. Usually these opinions are really surrounding this novelty dimension of creativity, though. So people tend to associate creativity with novelty or divergence from the status quo, and this tends to influence who and what they think is creative. So in my research, what I'm really curious about is understanding how those lay beliefs about what is creativity, how that influences who we think are creative, like in the workplace, so who we judge to actually have the cool new ideas, and how those lay beliefs also influence which ideas we deem to be truly innovative, right? Because often we're set up, there's an array of ideas in front of us. Maybe they're all pretty good, but how do we really figure out which is that really cool original idea that we want to pursue? And so my research is trying to figure out this judgment process and sort of the cues that we use to figure that out.
So could you tell me about what are some of these personal attributes that people might use, aspects of the target or the person, forming the idea as sort of a cue that this is likely to be a creative idea?
Sure. Yeah. So we'll talk about some different sort of areas of research I've done in this. So we can begin by sort of going back before my research. So in the 1980s, there was this really cool work done looking at screenwriters in Hollywood and how executives in Hollywood decided which sort of screenwriter pitches they liked, right? And what they found in this really interesting research was essentially that these executives are relying mostly on prototypes of creative individuals. Like, what's our sort of prototype or stereotype of creative individual? And those prototypes were influencing which of the screenwriters' pitches were considered creative. So if you're a screenwriter and you sort of fit the prototypical cool hipster screenwriter in the 80s Hollywood, I guess, context, your pitch is likely to be viewed positively and creatively. However, if you don't really fit that prototype, so you fit some sort of prototype that's sort of deemed uncreative in that context, you're less likely to have your pitch viewed positively. And so this was sort of classic research that was done a long time ago. And in my work, I was inspired by that to think, okay, so clearly people are influenced by attributes of the individual when they're trying to assess the creativity of their ideas. And so in some of my early work, I started thinking about demographic characteristics, right? So how do things like a person's gender, how do they sort of influence how creative that person's ideas are deemed to be? And so I found that there was this sort of systematic bias whereby people tend to attribute more creativity to a man's idea than to a woman's idea, even when those two individuals come up with the exact same idea, right? So in these experimental studies where I'm controlling for the actual idea itself, it's attributed more creativity when people think a man made the idea compared to when they think a woman made the idea. So I thought that was pretty interesting that we could just move around people's perceptions of creativity and the creativity of an idea based on the demographic characteristics of the person who was behind that idea. And so then, you and I actually have a paper together where we sort of thought about like, okay, if a person wants to seem creative, how should they sort of present themselves to others? And we showed that presenting yourself is sort of independent from others. So doing things by yourself, for instance, being seen by yourself, doing things at work. So like eating lunch alone, going to meetings alone versus in a little group, that these are cues that actually make you seem to have more creative potential, right? And again, this goes back to sort of these lay theories of creativity, right? Like the kinds of beliefs that people have about what it takes to be creative or what it means to be a creative person. And this tends to influence our perceptions about who is creative.
So this is all sort of filtering back to these beliefs that people are sort of independent and unique thinkers, right? And that, I might use someone's gender to form that judgment, but I might also use the extent to which they're, in groups of others when I see them walking around, or they're sort of, going their own way.
Totally, yeah. And thank you for making that point, right? So I didn't mention that in the gender study, the underlying sort of mechanism here is that people tend to assume that men are more independent than women. Right. And they also think to be creative, you have to be independent, right? So it's sort of, there's this alignment between like these stereotypes of men and this lay theory of what it means or takes to be creative. And this all sort of works together to lead people to make these attributions about men and their ideas that aren't necessarily applied to women and their ideas.
That's interesting. Chris, do we want to break at this point?
Yeah, I've got an interesting one. This is kind of thought-provoking. This is a question from Nazish, who asks, how does the measurement of creativity work long-term? Maybe we're stretching out beyond your purview, but I think this is thought-provoking here. Often ideas are generated during a brainstorm session, but it is really the final operationalization of an idea generated and implemented that shows how much value there was in that idea. In short, do we connect the value of creativity with overall business results? Any thoughts on that?
That is a really thought-provoking question. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think what you're getting at here is that this measurement of value, or this subcomponent of the definition of creativity that thinks about value, is very important, but often value is difficult to determine, right? So I think that sort of gets at the the trickiness of measuring how creative an idea is, right? Because I think what you're getting at is essentially we could have a brainstorming session and we say, that's a super creative idea. It's novel. We can measure that. And we think it's useful, right? We think it has value, but we don't actually know because we haven't market tested it. We don't know how feasible it is. We need to gather more information to understand if this idea truly has value for the business. And so I think perhaps what you're getting at here is that we often need to reassess that value judgment as the idea sort of is developed over time, and see if we're still thinking, yes, it has value, or maybe not.
As this novelty
seemed like a cool idea to begin with, but not so much now.
So maybe this is getting a little bit too into the weeds, but could you talk a little bit, Devon, about the relationship between perceptions of novelty and perceptions of value? Because I know you have other research on this.
I know, yeah. So this is a whole other area that I don't want to get us too far off course, but some of my other work, basically what it shows is that one of the challenges of getting creative ideas sort of gaining support for creative ideas in organizations, gaining traction for creative ideas in organizations, there tends to be a lack of consensus around the value of creative ideas, right? So as ideas become more novel, what we find in that research is that they also opinions tend to diverge more and more about the value of those ideas because people are sort of all over the place. Like some people think the idea might have really high value. Some people think it has no value. And so that lack of consensus then creates a barrier for those ideas because the minute a manager is asking their team, how much value does this super novel idea have? And half the team loves it, half the team hates it. That just makes the idea dead in the water, right? Because a manager needs some level of consensus to, get people on board and excited and have the idea move forward. So we find that is sort of a challenge, right? As ideas become more novel, judgments of their value become almost more difficult to determine, and we're more likely to see variation in those judgments, and we have to find a way to deal with that. But that's sort of a different topic, but it relates to the question, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, it's hard to be someone evaluating creativity and going back to the question, right? Like we might be able to tell relatively immediately if something is novel, but we might not know until it's been product tested and implemented if it's going to be useful, right?
Yeah.
And even on top of that, what you just described is the more novel something is, the more we might disagree about the likelihood that it's going to be useful. A hard job. Okay, so let's pivot back to thinking about perceptions of creativity. So we talked about the way that people judge creativity in others, and they seem to be using sort of general prototypes of a creative thinker or a creative, right? And sometimes that can be someone who's super independent, and sometimes that could be just a category like a Hollywood hipster, maybe. So how does this play out then when we're perceiving and judging creativity in groups?
Yeah, great question. So this sort of brings us full circle back to the beginning of our conversation. So I'll preface this by saying if we're looking at the objective link between diversity in groups and creativity, what we see in the literature is basically that it's very complex, the objective relationship. However, I also have research saying, okay, putting that aside, if we ask people what they think is the relationship between diversity and creativity, what we find is that people systematically expect demographically diverse teams to be more creative compared to demographically homogenous teams, right? So people have this strong assumption or expectation that diversity leads to creativity in groups, and that influences the way they make decisions in organizations. So for instance, which types of teams are selective for creative projects? Which kinds of teams' ideas are deemed to be creative, how managers think the best way is to organize people into teams for creativity, right? So this sort of lay belief that diversity leads to creativity, it's very pervasive, right? And we see it all over the place. And what my research sort of documents is, yes, the idea is there. People strongly believe that diversity leads to creativity. And this influences not only their expectations about different types of teams of people, and perhaps leads them to sort of underestimate the creativity of more homogenous teams, right? Because they think, to be creative, you have to be a diverse team. So, maybe this homogenous team is not going to come up with any creative ideas. But it also leads them to literally evaluate the exact same idea as more creative when they think a diverse team is behind it compared to a homogenous team. And this finding, I think, is interesting and important if we sort of juxtapose it with the actual research on the relationship between diversity and creativity, which basically tells us that we shouldn't assume that diversity leads to creativity. And so if we are assuming that, it might lead us astray, right? We might be more likely to sort of undervalue more homogenous teams' creative potential, overlook their ideas, et cetera. So that's sort of what that research is trying to get at.
That makes sense. I mean, this strikes me as something that's consistent with, I know that you use in your paper the term diversity heuristic, right? And this seems consistent with roughly any heuristic. It's just a rule of thumb, right? So it's, in some cases it may be correct, but it's not perfectly accurate. So for, small decisions, maybe using a rule of thumb is good. But when we're deciding which team is going to be tasked with the, creative task at work, or, whose team's ideas are the most creative, we could think about this also in entrepreneurial contexts. The consequences of relying on something as simplistic as just a simple heuristic, oh, it's a diverse team, must be creative, seem to stack up a little bit higher. Yeah.
Totally, yeah. And just going back to earlier in our conversation, I think you need to just take it a step further and say, okay, this team is diverse. That gives me one signal, but do we have any evidence that team also has an inclusive culture, right? Or has psychological safety or identity congruence? And if we are able to say yes to those things, then maybe our assumption that team's going to come up with a really creative idea is accurate. But simply seeing the diversity and assuming it's going to lead to creativity without these other factors is likely to lead us astray sometimes, given what we know from the literature.
Okay, that's a great place. I think you've basically spoken to this last question that I wanted to ask. So maybe I'll ask you to summarize overall. As we think about managers trying to accurately assess which teams are most likely to be creative, or the creative potential of a team, when all they know are things like variance and, say, surface level characteristics. What are the types of roadblocks that they face when they're judging creativity? We've talked about some of those, and how can they maybe surmount some of those roadblocks?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I think a lot of my research, and I know you do research on this too, is sort of thinking about how we're often sort of influenced by these attributes of individuals when we're assessing their performance that really should not be influencing our assessments of their performance, right? So in an ideal world, when we're trying to assess a new idea, we just want to think about that idea. We don't want to really be influenced by who made the idea, or the individual or team composition behind that idea. So just keeping that in mind, I think, can help managers sort of try to separate or avoid that information from contaminating their judgments of ideas, because ultimately we want to really have an accurate assessment of that idea and not be sort of biased by the person or people behind it. And then I also just think that we want to, from this research, think about whether we're sort of overlooking the creativity of less homogenous teams, right? When we think of homogeneity, I think we're often thinking of potentially a group of all men, right? That's sort of what our mind goes to. But, a group of all women is also a homogenous team based on the definitions that we've been talking about, right? And so we sort of want to be open and start to think sort of critically about this assumption that gender diversity, which would be a group of men and women together, we're assuming that's going to outperform both a group of all women and a group of all men, but we don't really have a lot of evidence that that's necessarily the case unless certain conditions are met. So just checking our assumptions, not being influenced by things that we shouldn't be influenced by, that kind of thing.
That makes perfect sense.
Sean Fath, excuse me, Devon Proudfoot, thank you two for coming in today, sharing your research, sharing some of the findings. I appreciate what you've done here. Thank you so much. Lots to think about. Viewers, I want to thank you as well for your questions. Lots of cool quality questions coming in there. Be sure to check out the Cornell Keynotes podcast, by the way. We're going to share the URL for that, in addition to links to Devon and Sean's courses. Lovely to have you two in studio today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You bet.